Imagine sitting in the dirt next to someone you know, someone you were just sharing food with yesterday. But right now, their chest isn't moving. Their skin is getting cold. You have no religion to fall back on, no funeral director to call, and absolutely no instruction manual for what happens next. It's just you, the crushing silence, an emotionless body that is very quickly going to become a massive problem. What do you actually do? For a long time, the standard assumption was that our earliest ancestors didn't do much of anything. We tend to picture primitive hominins just walking away, maybe dumping the body in the woods or leaving it for the scavengers, because we assumed that concepts like grief, honoring the dead, or grasping mortality required a massive, highly sophisticated modern brain. But the physical evidence archaeologists are unearthing right now completely shatters that idea. The truth is, early humans, and even species that existed long before Homo sapiens, engaged in responses to death that were so physically exhausting, so insanely complex, and in some cases so deeply unsettling, they would completely traumatize a modern person. We are talking about risking lives to navigate pitch-black, suffocating cave systems just to hide a corpse, or dismantling bodies bone by hand. Today, we're going to look at the physical proof of exactly what happened when the breathing stopped, and trace the exact moments our genus figured out what death actually was. But before we get to the recognizable acts of mourning, we need to talk about the very first graves ever dug. Because the earliest burials weren't designed to comfort the dead. They were designed to make sure the dead couldn't stand back up. When a body starts to decompose, it doesn't just quietly fade away. Within 48 hours, depending on the climate, the smell becomes something so overwhelming that it triggers a deep, hardwired panic in the back of the human brain. We have an innate, biological aversion to decay, evolved for a very practical reason. Decay means disease. It means danger. So, the very first time a human dug a hole and pushed a body into it, they almost certainly weren't contemplating the soul. They were solving a terrifying, immediate problem. They needed the danger out of the camp. But when we look closer at the archaeological record, the evidence reveals something that looks much darker than just waste disposal. In some ancient graves, like the Natufian burials in the Middle East, or various Mesolithic sites across Europe, dating back roughly 15,000 years, researchers haven't just found bodies peacefully laid to rest. They've found skeletons tightly bound in the fetal position, their knees forced tightly against their chests with cords before the muscles could fully stiffen. In other graves from around the same era, massive boulders were discovered placed directly over the chest, the pelvis, or the head of the deceased. In some extreme cases, the head was completely severed from the neck and buried separately. Now, science requires a bit of debate here. Some researchers argue these heavy stones were simply a practical way to keep hungry scavengers from digging up the shallow graves, or just the result of natural soil shifting over millennia. But many archaeologists look at the tightly bound limbs, the severed heads, and the heavy rocks, and propose a much more psychological explanation: genuine terror. For early humans, the line between a deep sleep, a coma, and actual death wasn't scientifically understood. A corpse was unnatural, unpredictable, and deeply feared. If this hypothesis holds true, pinning a body down with a boulder wasn't a mark of respect. It was a prehistoric insurance policy to make sure they didn't get back up. The very first burials might not have started as a pathway to heaven. They started as a prison. But while some groups may have been terrified of the dead walking again, other communities took the exact opposite approach. And what an entirely different group of humans was doing deep inside certain European caves is going to make the idea of tying up a body look incredibly tame. If you live in the modern world, your interaction with a dead body is designed to be as brief and sanitized as possible. The casket is closed, the grave is filled, and everyone goes home. But for thousands of years of human prehistory, death wasn't a quick event. It was a prolonged, incredibly intimate physical process. About 15,000 years ago, inside a place called Gough's Cave in England, a group of humans handled their dead in a way that sounds like pure nightmare fuel. When someone in their community died, the surviving members took sharp stone tools and meticulously stripped the flesh off their loved one's bones. They broke the long bones open, and with an astonishing level of care, shaped the tops of the human skulls into perfectly smooth drinking cups. At first glance, this just looks like brutal starvation cannibalism. And while survival cannibalism definitely happened in the ancient world, archaeologists analyzing Gough's cave noticed something important. These people were highly successful hunters. The site was filled with animal bones. Because of this, many researchers argue this wasn't about hunger at all. They believe this was a highly ritualized practice called endocannibalism. In this framework, letting someone you loved rot in the cold dirt to be eaten by worms might have been viewed as the ultimate disrespect. Consuming the flesh and keeping the beautifully carved skulls was, according to some experts, a profound way to absorb the deceased spirit, ensuring they never truly left the community. We see echoes of this prolonged interaction thousands of years later. Around 7,000 years ago in prehistoric Italy, early farming communities practiced something called defleshing. They would let a body partially decay, strip the remaining flesh away by hand, and then mix the clean bones with the remains of ancient ancestors deep inside caves. They were intentionally transforming the deceased from something raw and rotting into a permanent piece of the earth. What we instinctively view as a horrific mutilation was actually their deepest sign of love. They didn't push the dead away. They worked through their grief, literally with their hands, until the person was no longer a decomposing corpse, but an eternal ancestor. Taking a body apart bone by bone requires an enormous amount of physical and emotional endurance. But what happens when an ancient group decides a body has to remain entirely intact, but needs to be physically removed from the surface of the earth altogether? That is when the mourning process stops being intimately emotional and starts becoming incredibly dangerous. And the most mind-bending part of this next discovery? The creatures taking these terrifying journeys weren't even technically human. A dead body is incredibly heavy. When the heart stops, the body becomes what we literally call dead weight. Awkward, unyielding, and exhausting to move. From a pure biological survival standpoint, the smartest thing to do when someone dies is to either leave them exactly where they fell or drag them just far enough outside of camp so the smell doesn't attract wolves. Burning vital calories and risking your own life to transport a corpse makes absolutely zero evolutionary sense. But deep inside certain cave systems, researchers have found evidence that our ancient relatives might have been completely ignoring the rules of survival. And I say relatives, because we are now jumping back hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens even existed. In Spain's Cima de los Huesos, or the Pit of Bones, researchers found the remains of nearly 30 individuals from a species called Homo heidelbergensis, dating back roughly 430,000 years, concentrated at the bottom of a 40-foot vertical limestone shaft. And in South Africa, inside a cave system called Rising Star, an even more controversial discovery was made. Archaeologists uncovered hundreds of fossilized remains of Homo naledi, a small-brained hominin dating back over 250,000 years. These bones weren't near the cave entrance. They were located deep inside the earth, hundreds of meters back, past jagged rocks and down completely pitch-black, suffocatingly narrow stone chutes. Now, I have to be completely honest here. The Rising Star discovery has triggered a massive, ongoing fight in the scientific community. The team who found the bones argues that Homo naledi deliberately dragged their dead through the dark, crawling on their stomachs, navigating crevices where a single slip meant a broken leg and a slow, lonely death. Other paleoanthropologists fiercely push back, arguing that water washed the bones there, or that we simply don't understand the cave's ancient geology well enough yet to claim these were intentional burials. The fact that scientists are actively fighting over this is what makes it so fascinating. Because if the intentional burial theory holds true for either of these ancient sites, it represents a staggering shift in prehistoric psychology. It means that dragging a body through the dark wasn't a mistake. It means that a specific, highly inaccessible physical location had shifted from a practical disposal site into something entirely new, a sacred destination. By enduring the massive physical cost of carrying their dead deep into the earth, these early hominins would have been making a permanent statement. They didn't have the language to write a eulogy, but the sheer, agonizing physical effort of the journey was the eulogy. But hiding bodies in anonymous, collective deep earth graves is one thing. Eventually, humanity decided that simply protecting a body wasn't enough. And when archaeologists dug up a 30,000-year-old grave in Russia, They found a burial so insanely extravagant, it proves that even at the very dawn of human civilization, death was definitely not the great equalizer. We like to imagine that in prehistoric times, death was the great equalizer. We assumed that when you were a hunter-gatherer fighting just to survive the brutal Ice Age winter, everyone in the tribe was treated exactly the same. But the dirt tells a completely different story. About 30,000 years ago in Russia, at a site called Sungur, archaeologists uncovered the graves of two young children. They weren't just laid in a simple pit. They were absolutely showered in prehistoric wealth. The children were buried head to head, flanked by massive spears made from completely straightened mammoth tusks. But the most staggering detail was their clothing, which had long since rotted away, leaving behind more than 10,000 meticulously hand-carved mammoth ivory beads. Think about the sheer, mathematical reality of what that means. Experimental archaeologists estimate that each individual bead took roughly 45 minutes to carve. That means a small community of early Homo sapiens, living on the absolute edge of starvation and freezing temperatures, collectively stopped hunting and gathering. They dedicated thousands upon thousands of hours of elite, skilled labor entirely to a ritual that provided absolutely zero practical benefit to anyone still breathing. This is where the psychological shift becomes undeniable. You don't spend thousands of hours carving ivory beads for a corpse, or burying them with specialized hunting weapons, because a corpse needs to hunt. You do it because your brain has made a massive cognitive leap. You do it because you suddenly believe they are going somewhere else, and you are terrified they won't have what they need when they get there. And they didn't just pack weapons and wealth. In a 12,000-year-old Natufian grave in Israel, archaeologists found a woman buried with her hand resting gently on a puppy. Death had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a terrifying end of the road to be pinned under a boulder or dismantled bone by bone. It was the beginning of a journey. The living were desperately trying to pack a suitcase for the dead, giving them protection, status, and even companionship for whatever came next. This profound breakthrough, the realization that the dead still needed us, and that our relationship with them wasn't over, brings us to the final, most uncomfortable truth about how we handle death today. Because while our ancestors spent thousands of years building the concept of mourning from scratch by physically connecting with the deceased, the modern world has done something entirely different with our grief. We have spent the last few minutes looking at how our ancestors quite literally wrestled with death. They pinned it down with boulders out of terror. They stripped it to the bone with stone tools to keep it close. They may have dragged it through miles of pitch-black caverns, and they buried it under thousands of hours of carved ivory. Death for them was a raw, visceral, multi-stage process that demanded time, blood, and intense physical exhaustion. Now, look at how we handle it today. The modern funeral industry is designed almost entirely around sanitization and speed. When someone dies now, professionals immediately arrive to take the body away from the family. We use chemicals to delay the decay, hiding the exact reality our ancestors were forced to confront head-on. We put our dead in sealed boxes, lower them with machines, and hold a quiet, contained ceremony for an hour or two. The ultimate goal of a modern Western funeral is closure. We want the event to be clean and brief so we can move on with our lives. But by outsourcing the physical reality of death, we have arguably lost the profound psychological processing that our ancestors built by hand. They didn't want quick closure, they wanted permanent connection. They wanted to transform a terrifying, rotting corpse into a sacred ancestor that would stay deeply woven into the fabric of the community. Yet, despite thousands of years of civilization and technological advancement, the core instinct remains completely unbroken. When you feel that unique, heavy ache in your chest, and you feel an undeniable, almost magnetic pull to visit a specific patch of grass with a piece of carved stone over it just because someone you loved is underneath it, you are not just mourning. You are executing a piece of psychological code written hundreds of thousands of years ago by an ancient hominin standing in the dirt, looking at a motionless body, who simply refused to walk away. They didn't have the sophisticated language to explain what they were feeling, but they refused to treat death as nothing, so they picked up the body and did something about it. When you lay flowers on a grave today, you are doing the exact same thing they were doing. You just don't have to carry the heavy stones yourself.